David Miller's life had been reduced to a cycle of exhaustion, quiet resilience, and endless sacrifice. Ever since his wife passed away 3 years ago, he had been raising his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, alone in a tiny, dimly lit apartment on the edge of the city. To keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, David worked as a janitor at the city hospital, often taking late-night shifts when Emily was asleep in the care of their elderly neighbor. The pay was meager, but it was honest work, and he clung to it like a lifeline. That night, as he pushed his mop across the polished tiles of the emergency ward, he overheard frantic voices echoing from one of the trauma rooms. Curiosity pulled him closer, and what he heard made his heart pound. Doctors were rushing to save the life of a young girl who had been brought in after a devastating car accident. Her parents were nowhere in sight, and her tiny body was losing its battle. "We need AB negative blood, and we need it now," a nurse shouted, her voice trembling with urgency. Another doctor muttered that the blood bank didn't have any in stock, and the girl's pulse was slipping away by the second. David froze, his mind spinning. AB negative, that was his blood type, one he'd often thought of as a useless rarity. Without thinking twice, he stepped forward, his voice unsteady but firm. I'm AB negative. Please, test me. I can help her." The staff turned toward him, disbelief flashing across their faces, before swiftly moving him into a chair. Within moments, the procedure began, and David felt the warmth of his blood leaving his body, coursing through tubes toward the fragile child fighting for her life. He felt lightheaded, sweat beading on his forehead, but when he caught a glimpse of the monitors stabilizing, of the child's shallow breaths deepening, a wave of peace washed over him. For a man who had so little left to give, David had poured out the very essence of his being to save a stranger. As the nurse patted his shoulder, gratitude in her eyes, David closed his own, whispering a silent prayer, for the girl, for Emily, for the strength to keep going. That night, he left the hospital weaker than ever, unaware that this act of selfless sacrifice would alter the course of his life forever. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thin curtains of David's apartment as he stirred awake, his body aching with fatigue and weakness from the blood he had given the night before. Emily, his bright-eyed little girl, immediately noticed the paleness in his face as he tried to prepare her a simple breakfast of toast and watered-down milk. "Daddy, are you sick?" she asked, her tiny voice laced with concern. David forced a smile and brushed her cheek, whispering, "No, sweetheart, Daddy just helped someone who needed it." Though his words were calm, inside he carried the heavy toll of his sacrifice. His head throbbed, his limbs felt like lead, and yet he knew he couldn't afford rest. Bills sat unopened on the kitchen counter, red letters screaming overdue, the rent was only days away, and the refrigerator offered little more than scraps. When he arrived at work later that day, his manager eyed him with suspicion and irritation, remarking on his sluggishness and reminding him that another missed shift could cost him his job. David nodded silently, swallowing the bitter truth that no one cared for the battles he fought daily, the late nights, or the sacrifices he made. All that mattered was that he kept showing up. As he pushed his mop along the hospital corridors once more, he couldn't help but think about the child whose life now carried a piece of him. He would probably never know her name, never know if she truly survived or if his blood had only bought her a few more hours. And yet, even in his exhaustion, there was a quiet sense of fulfillment inside him, a fragile flame of hope that his sacrifice had meaning beyond his struggles. Walking home that night, with Emily's small hand wrapped tightly in his, David gazed up at the city's glittering skyline and felt the sharp contrast of his own world, one of dim lights, constant worry, and endless fatigue. He had no idea that the choice he made out of sheer instinct, the choice to give of himself when no one else could, was not a closed chapter. It was only the beginning of something far greater than he could imagine, a twist of fate waiting to reveal itself in the days to come. The following afternoon, David was startled by the sharp sound of tires screeching to a stop outside his rundown apartment building. Peering through the cracked blinds, he saw a sleek black car, its polished surface gleaming against the backdrop of peeling walls and broken sidewalks. Neighbors poked their heads out of windows, whispering in curiosity as a tall, commanding man in a tailored suit stepped out, flanked by 2 assistants. His presence seemed entirely out of place in this forgotten corner of the city. David, still feeling faint from the previous night's donation, answered the knock at his door with Emily clinging nervously to his leg. The man introduced himself as Jonathan Hayes, CEO of Hayes Enterprises, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. But Jonathan wasn't alone. Standing slightly behind him, holding a worn teddy bear in her small arms, was the same little girl whose life David had saved. Her cheeks were pale, but her smile was radiant as she looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. For a moment, David was too stunned to speak. He stammered that he was only a janitor, that he hadn't done anything remarkable, but Jonathan's expression grew solemn as he replied, "You gave my daughter, Lily, the chance to live. No words or riches could ever repay what you did." With that, he extended a thick envelope toward David, heavy with the weight of possibility. David's rough, calloused hands trembled as he accepted it, his mind whirling. He tried to protest, insisting he didn't need thanks, but Jonathan's voice carried a quiet authority that silenced him. "You acted when others could not. You gave your last drop of strength to save a stranger. I cannot let that go unanswered." Emily peeked curiously at the little girl, her eyes lighting up as Lily shyly waved at her. For the first time in years, David felt something unfamiliar stir inside him, hope. Yet, even as gratitude and disbelief warred within him, he couldn't shake the thought that this moment was only the surface of something deeper, that Jonathan Hayes had not come merely to offer thanks but to change their lives in a way David could never have foreseen. David sat at his small, rickety kitchen table long after Jonathan Hayes and his entourage had left, the thick envelope lying untouched before him like a mystery too heavy to open. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her curious eyes wide with questions, but David simply stroked her hair, needing time to process the surreal encounter. When at last he unsealed the envelope, his breath caught. Inside was not only a generous amount of money but also a formal job offer with Hayes Enterprises, a stable position as facilities manager with benefits, health insurance, and a salary beyond anything he had ever dreamed of earning. For years he had lived paycheck to paycheck, constantly afraid of losing the fragile balance that kept him and Emily afloat, but now, for the first time since his wife's passing, he saw a future that wasn't built on survival alone. The next morning, Jonathan himself returned, not as a distant CEO but as a father humbled by another father's sacrifice. He placed a firm hand on David's shoulder and said, "You saved my little girl when I couldn't. This isn't charity, it's gratitude. Let me help you build the life you and Emily deserve." David's throat tightened as he tried to form words, his pride and his gratitude colliding in his chest. Emily, sensing the change, hugged her father tightly, whispering, "Daddy, this means you won't be tired all the time anymore." Tears stung his eyes as he realized that his daughter, who had watched him struggle for so long, now saw the dawn of something brighter. In the days that followed, David stepped into his new role, carrying with him the humility of a man who knew the value of sacrifice and the strength of a father's love. Emily and Lily became fast friends, their laughter a constant reminder of how two families had been bound together by an act of selflessness. David no longer walked with his head bowed, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had been lifted by grace when he least expected it. His story was no longer just about struggle but about the extraordinary power of compassion, that a single drop of blood, given freely, could alter destinies and open doors to a future he never dared imagine.